Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming and for sticking around for our last session today. I know it's a beautiful day. We'll do our best to get you outside to enjoy the lovely outdoors and in the beautiful valley here today. I'm Brian Carver. I'm a planner with JUB Engineers. I work out of the office here in Logan, but it's my pleasure to introduce to you CODY LUTZ from Envision, Utah. And he's going to speak to us today about changing um, rules and regulations and attitudes about water use in Utah, and maybe we can finally get beyond the whiskeys for drinking, waters for fighting over mentality around here and actually do some good in our communities. So I'll take it away, Corey. Thank you.
Cody. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Brian. Steve. Yeah, whoever. They're interchangeable. Thanks for the introduction. Brian actually gave me my first planning related opportunity back when he was at Bragg, so it's always fun to reconnect with him. But thanks everyone for coming to my session at the end of the first day of the conference. You never know who you're gonna get. Um, as Brian mentioned, my name's Cody. My shirt size is large. Um, And I am a Utah State alumni, so it's always fun coming back here. As I was walking in today, I had a little bit of a flashback. This was the first place in this building that I voted in a civic election. Um, so always fun to come back and visit Logan. I work for a nonprofit called Envision Utah. We engage with Utahns to plan for a future that's beautiful, prosperous, neighborly, and healthy. And we develop some resources, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. Before we get into having the talk about how to have the talk, communicating with Utahns about water, I want to get a little bit of a feel for who's in the room today. Um, so maybe we can just do a raise of hands. Who's here from the Bear River region? That's these three northern counties here. A few locals. Okay, not a too local dominated of a room. How many of you are from the Wasatch Front region? That's where I currently live. Okay. Anyone from Mountain Land Association of Governments region? I've organized this by AOG because it's a planning conference. So that's Utah County, Wasatch County, and Summit County. Thank you, Tiffy. All right, we got a few. Did anyone make it from the Uinta Basin? Great. Welcome. 6 County, that's kind of central Utah. Couple, great. 5 County, we'll see if we can get the whole state represented. Southeast Utah. Great. Every region of the state is represented. That's good to see. So what I'll be talking with you today about is a water values messaging guide that we developed. This is based on a water values study that we engaged in. So I'll tell you a little bit about the setup of that water values study. But before I do that, maybe I'll just talk about a little bit about why it's important to be able to communicate with Utahns in a way that aligns with their values. I We do have some state agency folks out in the lobby reminding us that we have some water use elements of our general plans due. If you don't already have one, those are due by the end of the year, I believe. So this may apply to that, but there's other instances as well where you might want to educate your residents or community members about water use and how to use water wisely in ways that align with their values. So this information is based off of a online survey that we did. It was professionally administered to a random sample of 800 Utahns that were representative, kind of weighted by population based on county. So we got people from throughout the state. And kind of preceding this survey that we did some focus groups to get a little bit more of the ideation, and make sure we kind of knew what ideas people might have, and then we used the survey to see like how common each of those ideas were or how common those values were. Um, so we've distilled some of the findings down into a few what you need to know about how Utahns think and feel about water. And then later on, I'll share a few general guidelines about how to talk to Utahns about water. The first takeaway here is that Utahns understand water's significance to quality of life in Utah. We consistently find that water ranks as one of the top issues for Utah today and in the future. It actually traditionally has, when we've asked people to rank the importance for the future of Utah, water has traditionally come out as number one. It was recently eclipsed just barely by housing, but I think that's less representative of people not caring as much about water and more just people are kind of freaking out about housing prices. We asked people how they feel about their level of concern for the future of water in the state. And I want to say, doing some quick math here, but I think it's about 3/4 of people said they were at least moderately concerned about water availability and water quality here in the state of Utah. Um, Now, it's a little bit less intense if you ask them if we think Utah has enough water supplies to meet demands today. But if you ask people to think out 20 years in the future, they at that point they think, with all this growth, maybe we don't have enough water then. So it is something that people are thinking about and generally feeling a little anxious about the future of water in the state. So this is a little bit of a dense slide here, but we asked people kind of on this bottom square what their priorities are related to water. So kind of basic things like clean drinking water, plentiful and readily available water for daily needs. Those we expected to see. There were other things like water for agriculture, water for the environment, Great Salt Lake, Colorado River, kind of depending on where you are, whatever water bodies people think of that are significant in their regions. Um, but then we dive one level deeper and then kind of another level after that. But we ask people why they have these priorities about water, and really, these all kind of coalesced into the recognition that water is essential to all the things that give us a great quality of life here in Utah. We consistently hear that people value the communities that they have, the family values. In Utah, they value the economic opportunities that they have, and they value the outdoors and the scenic beauty of the state. And they kind of recognize that having enough water around is essential to sustain all of these things. And then one level up from that is just kind of the emotional level. Feeling like they have enough water gives them a hope for the future, gives them a sense of personal safety and security, uh, well being, balance, and wholeness. Things like that. Our second takeaway is that there, despite people's interests and there's a lot of things they do understand about water, but there's also a lot of things that they don't quite know about water. So I'll give a few examples of those. Um, the first is that we asked everyone if they use about average, less than average, or more than average water, and it turns out everyone uses less than average amount of water. Um, so maybe a little bit more optimism about how well people are individually doing on water conservation. Another thing that we heard was we asked people to um, rank how much water they think different kind of sectors here use, and they do correctly um, indicate that agriculture uses more water than kind of the M&I uses. The scale is a little bit off, but generally the takeaway is there. One of the things that stood out to us as not being quite right here is most people think that indoor residential uses are more significant users of water than outdoor residential uses, like yards, washing cars, things like that. Um, and if you look at the variability in water use over seasons, there's a lot less water used in winter because you're mostly using indoor use. And then that landscaping water use is actually quite a bit higher. So that's maybe a misconception to help clear up with folks. Um, we use these same kind of sectors of water use and ask people which they think are using too much water. So we kind of think of these as the water wasters and maybe areas where people see opportunities to improve. And people point to things like golf courses, parks, and sports fields as the biggest kind of water waster. And then Next in line there is outdoor residential uses, like landscaping. So we think that people do kind of see a lot of opportunity to improve with these types of uses, and specifically residential water use. Um, and we have a history of a few different campaigns regarding water conservation here in the state. By far the one that has gotten the word out the most is slow the flow, save H2O. And it has a few advantages. I don't want to say that these other ones haven't done a good job. But that one has definitely the best brand recognition. But generally, people are really supportive of efforts to promote education and awareness about water conservation. About 79% um, fully support those types of campaigns. So we think that those are something that can help people to do that kind of voluntary conservation. Our third finding here is that most Utahns feel they can make a difference and see a role for themselves, but that's not necessarily the case for everyone. And there are still some barriers that people have to taking action on water conservation. I actually found this finding really encouraging. Most people identify with this group with this statement that says the changes I make matter. We all need to do our part to conserve water in the state of Utah. We've got about another 40% that they're willing to make some changes, but they don't think it makes that big of a difference if they're working on an individual basis. And we only have about 7% of people that are totally disillusioned and don't think they need to do anything. When we asked people who they think has the most responsibility to help solve water shortage issues, they suggested that the state of Utah, the state government, probably has the largest share of responsibility there. But in the next place, they have just individual Utahns, people like you that live here. So we do think there's an appetite for individual and collective action. Um, you can see here there's also a role for the federal government and municipal governments in water conservation based on people's priorities there. So, those are some of our research findings. We worked to translate some of those into some recommended strategies for crafting messaging around water. You can use these principles, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe this is the type of language that goes in the water use element of your general plan. Maybe you're sending out a newsletter and you want to just add a little snippet in there about how people can conserve water this month. Um, Things like that. I'm sure you can think of other circumstances where you might want to talk to your community members about water. But the main messaging strategies that we'll suggest that we found out of this research are to first connect messages to Utahns' existing values. Two, to educate people about the specifics of what they can accomplish through water conservation. Kind of equip people with the data on how big of a difference they can make. Three, to use wording and phrases that resonate most with Utahns. We did some research called word equity that I'll get to later. And then we also found that using illustrations or images to help convey landscaping alternatives, people are generally more open to those than they might be to concepts about conservation, to language about conservation that they may not be as familiar with. So I'll take you through a few data points to kind of back this up. I mentioned the values here. Really, the takeaway here is just tying water conservation and water availability back to the great quality of life that people enjoy here in Utah. It's kind of the guiding star that motivates Utahns. I've got a few examples here of what we heard from people that they saw as the potential drawbacks to water smart landscaping. So people were concerned that it might not be as good for recreational uses, that it might make your yard hotter. I wasn't actually expecting people to be like so aware of urban heat islands, but it's apparently on people's radar, which is really interesting. And there's also a concern that water smart landscaping might not be as good for dogs or pets to play in. So some of these may be true, some of them, maybe uh, not so true depending on the design of the space. So if there's any way that you can dispel some of these fears, that's probably going to be helpful. I've also got an image here on the left. We did a little mini visual preference survey, and we found that people like to have some grass, but they actually preferred landscapes like the example shown here that aren't all grass. There's kind of enough grass here to play on, enough lawn space, but then there's some spaces on the edges that kind of break it up visually, and maybe they don't have to mow those spaces. Um, some things that Utahns mentioned would potentially motivate them to change their landscaping to be more water efficient, or if they knew that it was going to be affordable, if they could get rebate money or especially upfront incentive money to help them make the switch. They also mentioned that they would be more likely to change their landscaping if they knew it would be attractive and provide for the recreation and lifestyle needs of their family. Um, we did find that like people with young kids, the yard space, having a soft surface to play on and crawl around on if you're a kid was a little bit more important to those young families. So making sure that those needs are met still. And then they also mentioned that they would be more likely to change their landscaping if they knew that it would require less maintenance. So messaging that can kind of hit a few of these points may be beneficial. This is that data regarding we call these word equity questions here. And so there's words and phrases that people have a positive response to. Those can be kind of positively motivating. There are words that people have a negative response to, and these aren't necessarily words that you should avoid. They can actually be powerful motivators in terms of activating people's negative response. And then there are polarizing responses, which some people see positively, some see negatively, and those we generally think will be less effective at motivating action than the positive and negative responses. So you can see a few examples here. People like phrases like affordable water, water sustainability, water supply, water reuse and recycling. They see all these things positively. On the negative side, they have a negative reaction to terms like water waste or water shortages. On the grass side of things, I'll kind of give an example of how you might piece these together. But if you're talking to a resident about how they can update their landscaping, you might say, well, are there areas where you can preserve your existing recreational grass while converting some of the areas that have some useless or non-functional grass? Um, those are kind of ways that people will understand and kind of be on board with some of those ideas. We may have a couple more ideas here. Um, one thing that I thought was interesting is people actually preferred water smart landscaping to water wise landscaping. It was pretty close, but water wise seems to be the most common one that we use today. I certainly wouldn't advise against using water wise, but I was thinking that one might be the top one. People didn't respond quite as positively, but still somewhat positively to things like xeriscaping, desert landscaping, which is kind of different from what we heard in that visual preference survey. People didn't really like the most desert landscaping type options. Um, so I thought we were gonna have tables in here, but we don't. So maybe what we can do instead is we'll do a Q&A session at the end. Maybe just think about how you might use some of these principles in your community, kind of and what opportunities you might have to communicate with residents about water, and then kind of like what specific messages you might like to use based on this information. And I think you all have local knowledge of what's important to your community specifically. So I'd love to hear some ideas of how that specific local knowledge can be incorporated into conversations about water. So please think about that. I'll share a few examples that we've come up with, and then, as I mentioned at the end, we can do some Q&A, and part of that can be if you have ideas. I'd love a few brave souls to share those. Yeah, go ahead, Tippy.
Usually the terrace skating and the Deros skating. That's the biggest succession, at least if I can throughout my career, that people who mistake terrace skating for hero skating were just
Yeah, We didn't get into this too much in the survey, just where it was kind of like a set list of responses that they could select. But when we were doing our focus groups, that definitely came up. Like we asked people to share images of what they thought water-wise landscaping looked like, and there was a lot of just rocks. So I think that is like a good educational point that you can uh, bring up. Yeah, xeriscaping is desert landscaping, but it's not just rocks. Thanks, Tippy. And yeah, feel free to jump in with questions or comments as we go. We're all friends here in the planning community in Utah. Um, but a few messages that we came up with that build on these ideas are messages like smart water use is essential to everything that makes Utah a great place to live. Our communities, our economy, and the beautiful outdoors all rely on being good stewards of our water. This really harkens back to those core community values that I mentioned with that first recommendation. And it appeals to a sense of stewardship and responsibility that people have for taking care of the state. The other example I have here is when you save water, you save money, but more importantly, you help make sure that Utah remains a great place to live for future generations. Talking about future generations and talking about kids is really effective messaging strategy here in Utah, where we are so family oriented. A few other messages we have here are conserving water helps us to take care of the Great Salt Lake, or depending on where you are, the Colorado River, Lake Powell. I'm not sure what it would be up here in Cache Valley, actually. Obviously in the Great Salt Lake watershed, but people tend to think of themselves a little bit more separated from the Great Salt Lake. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on like what's your go-to water body that you talk about up here. But that's kind of an interesting, outstanding question. But the rest of that quote is when we take care of the natural world, our communities and our economy also thrive, and we're able to continue to do the things that we love. Um, Last one I've got here is when individual households manage water wisely, especially outdoor water, it supports the local agriculture and food production that help communities and the economy thrive. This message works because it connects individual water use with those greater priorities, kind of more on the priorities level of that values ladder. I didn't call it that, but those different levels of priorities and values that Utahns have about water. And again, it kind of harkens back to that sense of personal responsibility and stewardship. Um, I've got a few more. These are messages that illustrate how like specific information can encourage people. So just talking about the tools that are available. Um, on I don't know all of the water landscapes across the state, but in certain regions, I know that there are rebates and other financing mechanisms available through water districts or communities. The next one here has to do with just the degree with the the extent to which you can conserve water just by changing your landscaping. So suggesting that by installing water smart landscaping, you can reduce your water use and potentially your water bill by 2/3. Another one is about um, overcoming some of those fears that people have about water wise landscaping. So you can still do the things that you love with your family while still preserving water for future generations and your your kids and grandkids. Um, so this is a free resource that's available to communities. Hopefully you find it useful. There's a few other resources available on our website at envisionutah.org/tools. So hopefully you can find that and it's useful to you, but I'll just open it up to question and answer. And then hopefully get some local examples of how you might use this information as well. If anyone wants to jump in or has any questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that person, we really very immediately standard in pretty honest that work with the well. Feedback, we've gotten a lot of feedback with that and then about answer a lot of things. With that you feel around they could strict their standards that we pay minimum and maximum for water pump.
Sorry, one could. Yes, no. Do we need him to restart, or could you guys hear enough?
Can you hear this?
Okay.
All right. City of Moab Water Standards Ordinance recently installed. Basically, two different perspectives. One, as a private owner, issues with how onerous that can be, in kind of a water metering discussion. So right now it's just a prescriptive standard, but there's been a lot of push towards a water metering situation. So that's definitely we found to be very polarizing, but also could be more effective from a development standpoint. So individual owners really opposing the idea of water metering in any way, not that we would restrict water, just or yet anyway, but that we would charge at different rates for percentage of use, giving them full flexibility of if you want to pay for more water, then you pay more for your increased landscaping options, which is what developers are looking for. They'd rather just pay more and build what they want versus saying we have a prescriptive rate. So how water metering for those communities that are starting to implement these standards is effective, ineffective, or that different kind of next level of water. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting example. I don't think I have any great answers for you. I know Weber Basin Water District has had some success with monitoring it. I don't know if we have any representation from them here today. But from this conversation, I do think it obviously doesn't solve your problem, but kind of keeping the discussion rooted in why we're interested in conserving water could potentially help. But yeah, obviously a challenging ongoing process. You wish you luck. And anyone else?
At the beginning of your presentation, then you went through a lot of things from a survey, perceptions that people had. But what's the reality? Where could you target trying to get the best savings as opposed to residents, as opposed to, say, golf courses or municipalities and city parks? Now, obviously, if you've got a city like I'm from American Fork, if you have 45,000 people, they cut 5%. That's going to save more than a golf course saving 5%. But isn't an equivalent. Sometimes I see these courses just pouring water out, and I see the golf course or the parks just pouring water out. They set the meter in May and they never touch it again till October. Where would be the best place to focus conservation? I mean, you've hit residential very hard, but do we do anything with municipal or with golf courses or any of these other facilities? How effective would that be? How beneficial?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And yeah, you point something out that's important to keep in mind about the messaging guide. The messaging guide is kind of targeted to the residential water conservation, where that's something voluntary that community members can do. I think we're to the point in Utah where we need kind of an all of the above approach to water conservation, and kind of a culture of water conservation. You mentioned golf courses and parks. There's probably just eliminating waste that could make a big difference in those areas without even having to actually change the landscaping. So I think that's important as well. Something I didn't go into too much here, but that's kind of an interesting conversation, is you've probably heard or seen some news articles about agricultural water uses and how we're shipping all our water to China via alfalfa and stuff. Um, we heard a little bit of that um, in the focus group, but I was actually kind of surprised based on those articles that I've seen that people weren't more accusatory towards agricultural water use in the survey. Basically, I'd summarize how people are feeling about agricultural water use as they want to know that agriculture is doing its part to conserve water, but they're not like, oh, I shouldn't conserve any water because agriculture uses way more water than I do. So I think again that kind of points back to a bit of an all of the above approach where everyone needs to do their part.
Thank you. I was just curious, and maybe I might have missed this in your slides. When you were talking about kind of the outdoor recreation sector, was there any kind of substantial response in regards to like the ski industry and how ski resorts, their impact on water use and how, that section of recreation is so fundamental to Utah and kind of what people move here for? Has that come up in the conversation about this at all?
I don't recall like ski resorts coming too much in terms of like as a water use. It does come up when you talk about things like the Great Salt Lake and lake effect snow and like how that affects the tourism industry. So we did hear some of that, but not so much of uh, resorts as a water user. And if we do run out of questions and ideas, I don't think anyone would be too mad to get a little bonus time on the first day of the conference. But please, if you have anything to add, hop in. Go ahead, Tippy.
Thanks. I'm wondering if in your focus groups you had any insight into whether messaging about how indoor water uses are not as intensive as outdoor water uses, if that changed anybody's mind toward density in terms of, a lot of NIMBYism and the growth that we're seeing. Has that been a positive tool toward, you know, um, citizens and residents' sentiment toward growth?
That's a really interesting question, Tippy. We didn't get that far in this research, but I think that's certainly an interesting research question. We did in the focus groups kind of try to get a little bit for a feel if people get the difference between consumptive water uses and like return flows. So indoor water use, a lot of that gets flushed and goes kind of back into the water treatment system, gets treated, goes into the Great Salt Lake or back into a river or whatever. And then outdoor water use, of course, a lot of that is evaporated. You can't really consistently count on any of that to re-enter the water cycle. People don't really get that at this point, so that's maybe something that would be interesting to educate people about in the future and try to get a little bit more literacy around that. Let's go ahead and call it. Thank you everyone for coming to my session. Enjoy the rest of the conference and your time in Logan.